Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahi wa kafa, wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da wa ba'd. Alhamdulillah, we are starting and hoping to complete from the years 764 to 864. Now there's a lot of material here, although the handout's only 3 pages, there's a lot of background material. Inshallah, we'll be able to complete it and cross over it. Now we're looking at the years 764 to 775, some key events that took place. In the year 764AH, there were massive floods and storms that swept Sham and Egypt, and the environment began to change around the people in light of the battles and trials that were unfolding. On Wednesday, the 12th of Muharram, 767AH, the Franks passed through Cyprus and then Alexandria, devastating, killing, looting, and pillaging, while they were retreating back into mainland Europe. This would be their farewell to the Muslims before heading back to their home countries. Now, the Franks, as we already established, from the time of the Crusades, when the Muslims were able to gather the repeat action rifle, they were defeated, but the small pockets and enclaves that they were in, they still had to be lifted and uprooted out of those. One of the places that they had strengthened their base was Sicily, and another place was Cyprus. Sicily was from the Kelbi Empire and was being slowly, the last traces of it were being obliterated, to the point to where now, if you go to Sicily, you will not be able to recognize that Muslims ruled there for a number of centuries. You won't be able to recognize that Muslims lived there for centuries, because most of the traces of it have either been painted over, obliterated, or frescoes have been built around it. You can't even recognize that Muslims were there. A similar situation in Austria, similar situation in Hungary. You don't even know that Muslims were there because it was wiped out. Cyprus was the same way. Now we know that Muslims have had a foothold and were in Cyprus before this division. They were there from the time of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. They were there. Hiram is buried there. So we have one of the companions buried there and a number of others. It's figured as a strategic place in history for a number of years. Now, as we know it, Cyprus tends to be divided. It's divided between the Greek side, which is recognized by what's called the international community, i.e. Franks. And then there is the so-called Turkish side, which is not recognized by the international community, which are Turkish, read Muslim. That is a side that's unrecognized, underdeveloped, really rickety and tore down looking, and there's sewage problems and all these other issues because it's unrecognized by its Frankish masters. But Cyprus at this point was undivided, but there were struggles over the island. Now in the year 768 AH, this brought a huge earthquake that rocked the city of Safad in Sham. Tragedy struck in 769 AH when the still retreating Franks rushed through Trablus, known as Tripoli, damaged the gates, murdered, looted, and made general annihilation of the inhabitants. The ruler of Cyprus had been helping the retreating Franks and used his strength to help them establish a foothold. However, he died 770 AH, and the new ruler sought a truce with the Muslims, and this was accepted. Now, look at the information here regarding all of the earthquakes, floods, storms, because all of these tribulations are coming from the Frankish invasion, Tatar invasion, the Crusades, and inshallah next week the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition, the Reconquista of what was now called Spain and Portugal. Right? All these things are starting to happen, and as they happen, more tribulations come about and more trials strike the Muslims. But the one thing that we've been told of a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ in the Musnad of Imam Ahmed is he made a number of supplications to Allah. One of the supplications is that the ummah would never be annihilated in whole. They would never be annihilated in whole. And that supplication was accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There was another dua that is in Sahih al-Jami', in which this ummah was referred to as an ummah marhuma, a ummah that has had mercy given to it. And its punishment in this life is by the sword, massacres, and slayings. Whereas in the akhirah, it won't have any punishment as an ummah. So the ummahs in the next life, the ummah of Bani Israel are being punished in mass, with few exceptions. The ummah of the Nasara, which are a subset of Bani Israel, are being punished in mass, with a few exceptions. But the Muslims are going in as an unpunished ummah, with only a few exceptions, who will suffer some temporary punishment. And that's the difference. So the Prophet ﷺ, with this ummah, when we see all these things happening, and sometimes Muslims will say, well, everywhere we go, there's 48 Muslim countries. And look at all the things that are happening. 48 Muslim countries that are majority countries. We're being killed, we're being slaughtered, we're being maimed. There's all types of hurricanes and tornadoes and things going horribly wrong, and towers falling over on people and everything. Even in the best of times, this is before the current stage that we see ourselves in now. These things were happening. Why? Because of the fact that these things have been prophesied. Now, what may seem like an easy ride that other nations are getting is because they are condemned to eternal judgment as a nation. This ummah is not condemned. Rather, its history is one of rahmah, of mercy. And so the massacres and the slayings and the things that are there, those people become martyrs. And in the hereafter, as they're on the other side of the barzakh, they supplicate for this ummah. They make dua for this ummah. They ask that Allah blesses this ummah. And all these other things. And on the day of resurrection, when each one of them receives the 70 crowns that they've been promised, and in some narrations 72 crowns and mimbars of light, and they're sitting on thrones of justice, and all these other things that the martyrs receive, and they can intercede for 70 members of their family. At that point, those that had been saying to themselves, I just don't understand why all this has happened. At that point, those that had been saying that as our Muslim brothers and sisters, who themselves may be deserving of some punishment, and they get saved by one of those people, will realize the divine wisdom and the purpose and principle and mercy in all of this. So, if you look at the fact of seeing it in this way, this ummah is having all of its punishment taken out of the way, so it goes into an akhirah spot fresh. Final hadith before I move on, where the Prophet ﷺ said, this is the last ummah coming into the world, but you shall be the foremost on the day of resurrection. The example of this ummah is what I shall mention to you. The children of Israel came, who followed the Jews, and their time period lasted from one portion of a day to the other, and they were given one reward and one portion of wealth. The Christians came, and they were given one portion of wealth from working one portion of the day to the other. The Muslims came and worked one portion of the day to the other, and they were given a double reward. When the children of Israel and the Christians protested, Allah says, this is my decree, and I do as I will. This hadith is in the Sahih of Imam Bukhari. What we also take from that is another hadith that's in Sahih al-Jami', in which the Prophet ﷺ said, out of 70 ummahs, I chose you. Out of 70 ummahs, I chose you. So we didn't choose him, he chose us. So you must understand this. So look at this ummah. Now, 762AH brought about difficulties when a huge firestorm started that was seen in Sham that burned red hot And there were also dazzling shooting stars, the most on record, that lit up the sky. Had it not been after Isha, some of the people might have thought it still Maghrib. Now this statement regarding the most on record that lit up the sky, that statement is coming from Imam Ibn al-Imad, rahimahullah. What that shows us is that Muslims were keeping records on shooting stars. There were people that were scholars of meteorology, people that understood about astronomy and everything like this. Because nowadays, we're being taught in this pidgin that is being passed off as a language, English, that no one until the 1700s or 1800s knew anything about science or math or learning, had studied the sky or understood anything about what was going on in cyclical patterns. No one knew anything about that until one day, an old man, originally coming from England, was flying a kite in the rain with a key, a brass key attached to the top of it. And lightning struck it and sent him back with a jolt. And all of a sudden it was realized and discovered electricity. Took thousands of years. No one else knew anything about it. Although there's pictures in pyramids in Karnak, which are 3,400 years ago, that look like massive light bulbs being used to light those pyramids and illuminate them. But all these thousands of years, no one knew. No, that's completely bogus. Remember, 1000 AD, got 70 hospitals in Baghdad. They were later destroyed in 1258, but we already had 70 hospitals in Baghdad. We had observatories. Imam Ibn al-Jawzi had an observatory. Imam Muwaffaq had an observatory. People were already measuring things, talking about comets. People had already prepared huge manuals of botany on the history of plants and trees and all these other things and vegetation. Do not be deceived into thinking that all knowledge and wisdom suddenly appeared in the middle of a cornfield in Ohio in the 17 or 1800s from a man wearing a powdered wig because the syphilis was ravaging his body and eating the hair out of his head. But somehow he stumbled across electricity and science, and an apple fell on another man's head who was wearing the same type of powdered wig because he had the same syphilis ravaging his body, and he somehow discovered all the laws of the universe that we depend upon. Do not be fooled by this. Civilization is bigger than that, and knowledge was greater than that. Had it not been after Isha, some of the people might have thought it was still Maghrib. Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani began an ambitious writing project in the year 763 AH, by which, at the end of his life, he would demonstrate that he was one of the greatest scholars of all time. He was one of the greatest scholars of all time. This Ibn Hajar that is being referred to is Ali Ibn Hajar. Ali Ibn Hajar. He is the father of the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani that we know of, who wrote Fath al-Bari. We'll be talking about him, inshallah, a little bit later. But this is the father of the Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani that we generally know of. And he wrote numerous books. The Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun, preferential mujtahids, had been reigning for some time, but were starting to become increasingly rare since the beginning of 700 AH. Now again, we have to talk about this because it's important. In the beginning of the era of the first three generations, you had all six types of mujtahids simultaneously present. But there began to be the times that came in which the absolute mujtahids, mujtahidun and mutlaqun, like the four imams, Aisha, al-Hasan, al-Hussein, these were the people that set down the principles, explained and broke them down. They'd memorized all of the available literature, the Quran and the Sunnah, all of it. So when you read about Imam Ahmed memorizing 1 million ahadith and the Quran, that's everything. That is the revealed law. After them came the mujtahidun and mutlaqun fil madhab, the absolute mujtahids within the madhab. Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani for the Hanafis. Right? You had Abu Bakr al-Athram, Abu Bakr al-Marwazi, Abu Zur'a al-Razi for the Hanbalis. And you had Za'afarani and Dhafar and others for the Shafi'is. And for the Malikis, they had their scholars. After that comes al-Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun, the preferential mujtahids. These are the people that go through all of the books left behind these two categories of people and simplify and make it easier for the layman to understand what the ruling is on a given matter. Because there's this massive diffusion of knowledge and books and information. And someone's got to be in charge of dealing with this. Now, you could tell that the Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun were starting to become rare. Because when the son of Ibn Daqiq al-Eid the elder met Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, who died 728 Hijri, he kissed Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah on his forehead and said, "Praise be to Allah, I thought that I had seen the last of your kind." What that meant is that the Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun were so rare. When he finally ran across Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah and some of the other people, he said, "I thought I had seen the last of your kind." So they were rare. What do these people do? As I mentioned, they go through the books and explain the different things. If anybody gives a read through Taqiyuddin Ahmad Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, his Majmu' Fatawa, with the right knowledge and they know how to do so, they will notice that when you go through all 37 volumes and read through them, there are some evidences, but he's mainly, like every other Mujtahid Murajjih, saying there are some 5 statements on this topic. And he'll give you all of the statements, everything that's said on a given topic. The Jamhur, minority positions, rare positions, everything. And then he'll tell you the preferred position is this one. He'll go through all of that. His job is to memorize all of that material and be able to tell you the preferred position is this one. So you'll find sometimes within the books of Murajjih, Mujtahids, they'll be quoting 6, 7 aqwal or statements. And then they'll sew everything together and say, the bottom line is this. So you won't find a lot of evidence in their books. That's for the Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun, or the absolute Mujtahids themselves. That's where you find all the evidences and all the arguments. But for the Mujtahid Murajjih, you don't find a lot of proofs in their books because that's not what those books were written for. They've already memorized all those proofs and those other things. What they're doing is they're giving you, if for want of a better word, a computer readout of the end result. Because the common person is not coming to them for ilal and qiyas and istishab and amalu ahl madin. They're not coming to them for all of these under machinery pieces. Just as much as when you go to the mechanic, you're not going to the mechanic for him to say, now listen, your fuel injectors are not interacting with, and then he goes into the full explanation. You're not going to the mechanic for that. You're going to him to say, has my car passed its MOT? And if it hasn't, what's wrong with it so I can pay you and get it done? He knows all of that stuff, but he tells you, well, you've got 2 options. You've got a massive inflation in your tire. I could repair it, but there's still that weak spot in your tire. Or I could change it for a new tire. But you don't wait for him to go into the breakdown of the radial and how the inner tube workings of the tire go, and you don't wait for that. So the preferential mujtahid, he has all the machinery in front of him, but he can give you the readout on any given subject and tell you this is what the preferred position is. So the layman will often come and say, well, I've heard so many different things about where the hands go. What do I do? Preferential mujtahid, there are these different positions that you've mentioned, but the strongest is this. And that's it. Then if you ask and say, well, what about this proof and that proof? Then he says, the points that you've mentioned, this is held by this group. This position on this understanding of this evidence is held by this group. This understanding is held by this group, and this understanding is held by this group. But your understanding should be this. That's what the preferential mujtahid does. Now, those people began to die out. Because if you have no one to teach, you have to have preferential mujtahids in order to teach preferential mujtahids. So the fact that they were dying out meant that the people who were dying out. It was becoming a rarefied science. And a lot of people weren't able to fully grasp what it is that these people did because they became so rare in their time. So if you look at, say, people like Taqiyuddin Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, the 11 masail that are difference of opinion aside, if you look at him, Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, those were people who had incredible tribulations in their time. Why? Because the true mujtahid is not a product of his time. The true mujtahid is not a product of his time. Here's what I mean by that. If someone is a mujtahid and deriving rulings and masail, the job of the mujtahid is going to the book and the sunnah and deriving the rulings. The Quran and sunnah are timeless, are they not? They last for every era, every age. So when someone is a mujtahid, he belongs to the Quran's age, which is timeless. And that's why he's able to derive new masail and tell you, even though he's living, say, in the 1950s, he's able to see hundreds of years forward. For example, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, although living in the 8th century of the Hijrah, had a vision in which he was shown a grid layout of the earth in longitudinal, latitudinal lines. And he drew out the entire globe. That map was taken and used by a few Muslim sailors, and if you look, you can see near Africa the northern tip of Antarctica. For those who might be interested to know, our Frankish colleagues did not discover Antarctica until hundreds of years later. But in just a vision, just a keshf, just a snapshot, he sees the earth spread out like a flat plane, longitudinal lines, latitudinal lines, and all the continents. And states in one of his fatwa, there are 7 continents on earth. On the other side, when it's light on one side of the earth, it's dark on the other side. There are few people living on the other side because there are still great ice sheets that are preventing more upward mobility. The continents are like, and he's going into all these explanations. The continents, if you go under them, are not empty. There's water, but the continents extend under the oceans. And they're floating on top of the rest of the dirt that goes under them. And sometimes they move and there are fissures in the earth, and going into all these details. Before the onset of geology, before the onset of paleontology, before the onset of archaeology, all these different things that now we depend on and say, well, fortunately we found this out. Because people back then, they sure were stupid. So the preferential or any type of mujtahid, a real mujtahid, he's not a product of his time. A sheikh might be. He's a product of his time. The local elder in the masjid, he's definitely a product of his time. But the mujtahid is not, because he's thinking outside of time and space. So sometimes a fatwa will come and you'll think, subhanallah. And sometimes the mujtahid will be persecuted in his time because he's outside of it. Like, for example, Imam Muwafiquddin, he wasn't persecuted for it, but people thought it was bizarre. He said, it is impermissible for a woman to sell her own eggs, which are in her ovaries, because her ovaries do not belong to hers. The ulama's first response was, first of all, how do you know how many eggs? That a woman's eggs are in her ovaries. And then he says that there are a predetermined amount of eggs, and each woman is given no more than the predetermined amount in her ovaries. Do you know they started saying that in 1996? This is 900 years ago. The predetermined amount. She may not sell those. They are not for hers to sell. Nor are they allowed to make other human beings for them without the consent in which it would be her own children, because it will create issues of lineage, and it will create an environment in which monsters will be made. He's discussing the fiqh of crops. How on earth did this get in here? Because of looking forward. Mujtahids are looking forward. So in the case of the woman that gave some of her eggs to her daughter because she was infertile, her daughter has a child that she's now the grandmother and the mother to. Because really, they're her eggs. That creates havoc with inheritance. Creates all types of tribulations. And the mujtahids have to sort it out when something like this happens. All these type of issues that you see, right? Last example before I move on. You had Dr. Mikhail Debaki. He comes to Muhammad Hassan al-Shanqiti and Abdullah Muhammad al-Khulayfi and says, I want to bring about a new type of surgery to help people who are suffering, to make people live longer. And it has to do with the use of the pig aorta, which is the most similar to the human aorta. They both gave tacit fatwas in support of it. Go ahead. On the condition that you will try to develop a synthetic one first. That's their position. So these two ulama far ahead, and they had incredible criticism from other ulama. How can you use everything from the pig is haram, it's najis, it's a haram beast, it's something it's been made impermissible, all these other things. And those two mujtahids said, we agree with you. Muhammad Amin Shanqiti rahimahullah said, I agree with you. But don't you remember the fact of darura? What is the darura in Sharia? Darura is anything in which you will lose your life, a limb, or be jailed for a period of time in which you will die during that time. This is the darura. Don't you know that there are people without this who will die? Who will suffer incredibly? Therefore, my fatwa is that this was darura. It was necessity. That's mujtahids looking far ahead. Where other mujtahids may not always understand, like for example, Sheikh Muhammad Watawali Sha'rawi died with the position that it was haram to give blood and organ transplants. Both were haram. Giving blood, taking blood, organ transplant, they're haram. He's a major alim. Who on earth can dispute with Sheikh Muhammad Watawali Sha'rawi? No one. But that was his fatwa. Other ulama are looking ahead. When television came, most of the ulama gave a blanket rejection of it. But one of the sheikhs said, no, this is a device that produces signals and sounds. If we block all impermissible signals and sounds, it will become halal for us to use it for any permissible utilization that we have, for listening to recitation, seeing people reciting, or seeing beneficial lectures. But if you cannot control the venue which has been released among you, it's haram to have it. And the other scholars agreed. But at first, their position was tacit. No. So you have to look at fuqaha, how, and mujtahidun, like this, when they're looking forward, the real mujtahid is not a product of his time. So they will say things that in their own time, to other mujtahids, they realize their wisdom, but they think that's slightly bizarre, or how could that be connected with that, or why would they say that? So the mujtahid exists outside of his own time. He's not a product of his time, right? So the mujtahidun al-murajjihun had been reigning for some time, but starting to become increasingly rare since beginning of 700 AH. It would be the late 800s, I want to mention, where mujtahidun al-murajjihun would finally die out. And it would leave you with mujtahidun al-mukharrijun. And those are the people that derive new masail, they do other things, and those people will always be around. And we'll have to discuss that later. Now we have deaths during this time. Deaths during this time include Ibn al-Naqib al-Masri, who's a major Shafi'i scholar. He is the author of the book that's been translated into English, The Reliance of the Traveler. It is that seminal text that is used today in the English language that has made so many people happy, because it was a book that went from the beginning of wudu and water all the way to the end. And in the English language, there had been no book and no one that was doing it when this book came out. I remember seeing whole families change madhabs. I mean the grandparents, the parents, and their children, and the uncles and on down. Because They had no other resources to go to, and they said, we're just going to take this and we're going to hold on to it with everything we've got. It makes sense, it's clear, it's lucid. The English that's used, the style that's being used is easy for anyone to comprehend. We're going with this. And they just held on it. They just held on to it. And that's a testament to their knowledge. And that's a testament to Imam Ibn al-Naqib al-Masri, rahimahullah. Another alim that died was Shihabuddin Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Shiraji, who was a Hanbali judge. Salahuddin Abu Safa al-Safadi in 764 AH. Shamsuddin Abu al-Faraj ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, who'd been taken prisoner by the Tatars and later escaped. Jalaluddin Abu Hafs al-Anbari. Sidi Muhammad Wafa al-Masri, a major Maliki scholar and head of the Shadhiliya Tariqa in his time. All of these ulama died 765 AH. You then had Burhanuddin ibn Qayyim, who was the son of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. You had Sitt al-Arab al-Musnida, who was a great female scholar who died in 767 AH. Musnida means not just someone who's memorized the Musnad, but they've memorized over 100,000 ahadith. So this sister, having the name Sitt al-Arab, means the lady chief over all the Arabs. This was her name. Sitt al-Arab al-Musnida, scholar of the Musnad, scholar of the narrations, memorized at least 100,000 ahadith. I've said this before and I say it again. If you look in history under chapters of du'afa and mawdu'at, chapters of weak and fabricated ahadith, you won't find in there a woman categorically being classified as a liar or a fabricator of hadith, or categorically classed as weak because of memory. Our general understanding of the females were that the females has had and have a stronger memory than the men for memorizing people, their lineages, and their family, and so forth. And it's because of this you have this plethora of female scholars that were there. All the other ulama include Afifuddin Abu Muhammad al-Yafi'i, who was a major Shafi'i scholar. Abdul Wahhab ibn Ahmed al-Dimashqi, who was a major Hanafi scholar. Now, at this time, the Hanafis started coming more into Damascus, so they'd been in Central Asia. And as the Mu'tazila began to collapse within the Hanafis, because they started to be ran out of the Hanafi domains, some of the Hanafis began to come into Damascus and other areas. Now, Damascus, then and now, the dominant creed that's taught throughout the urban cities is the Ash'ari creed books. So the Hanafis became Ash'aris in that area. That's why you'll find of all the different Hanafis you'll meet, that's the only time you will meet Ash'ari Hanafis. And so you will see this difference when people say that are from Central Asia coming from that background, and they go and study in Sham, they notice some slight differences in the ways that the Hanafis who are Arabs, who are Ash'aris from Damascus, how they explain the creed. For example, if someone studies and they say, okay, what are the 14 core attributes? The 14 attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives in the Quran to show the difference between him and a false god. What are those 14 main attributes? Hanafis who are Ash'ari say there aren't 14, there's 13. It's a semantic difference. But you'll notice that, so you'll look in the books and say they've got 13 listed here and not 14, of course. Well, Hanafis are Maturidis. Well, all of them except for these. So the position for Hanbalis and Hanafis that are Maturidis is no 14 attributes. But for those who are Ash'aris, they say the attribute of creation comes under Allah's power. So we don't see that as a separate attribute. Whereas the Hanbalis and Maturidis say, yes, it is. It's a separate attribute. This is semantics. Do they all accept the ayat? Yes. Do they all accept that it's an attribute? Yes. But it's the dispute of how it's understood and explained. And so looking at the books of great Ash'aris, for example, Abdul Ghani al-Maydani, he is one of the great commentaries on the Tahawi text. He's an Ash'ari Hanafi. You look at the Al-Attar family. They're Hanafis, but they're Ash'aris. The Al-Khursa family. They're Hanafis, but they're Ash'aris. Right? Sheikh Muhammad Fuad al-Barazi, who I learned from, he's a Hanafi, but he's an Ash'ari. And the differences will be slight, but you'll be able to see them. Right? Differences that you will notice. Like, for example, some of them, when you speak to them about, say, the household of the Prophet ﷺ, by household I mean his parents, his grandfather, or his uncle, they hold a position that is diametrically opposed to that which is in this room. Diametrically opposed to the position of most people in this room that I'm sitting in talking today. And I won't mention it because I don't want to cause a controversy again, because I just mentioned it last time. And there was green wood stacked up outside with ropes. I just mentioned it. I didn't even quote it. I just mentioned it. But the reason why I state it is because if you go and study someplace, you need to realize that those people there are just as dedicated to the Hanafi madhab as you, but the Ash'aris. And so you're going to be looking to read books like Aqa'id al-Nasafi, Maturidi scholar, great, wonderful scholar. Aqa'id al-Nasafi, no dispute. But they're going to be reading to you from the commentary of Sa'aduddin al-Taftazani, who's what? An Ash'ari. An Ash'ari. They're not going to be reading to you from Al-Bazdawi, who's a Maturidi. And when you look at the commentaries side to side, you're going to see some differences. That's normal. That's normal. But I say this because if somebody plans on going and studying, do not make the assumption that everyone must think exactly like you and everyone's going to be exactly like the Maturidis of Central Asia. They defended this religion. They upheld the Hanafi method when it just wasn't being upheld. There wouldn't be a Hanafi method if they didn't. That can't be disputed. They're the champions of that method. They are. But those that came westward took on that creed because why? There were no teachers at all to teach it. And the laity that came to them had no teachers at all to teach it. So what could they do? They went to the books of the Ash'ari creed, al-Barahin and these other documents. And so the Hanafis of Damascus, you will find them in the same way. Further to this, you have Ibn Shaykh al-Salamiyya, Hanbali scholar of Cairo, Muwafaq al-Din al-Hajjawi, chief judge of Cairo, Zainuddin Abu al-Faraj al-Dimashqi, brother of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, Abu al-Muhasin Yusuf al-Mardawi, and 764AH. You also find Ibn Qadi al-Jabal, who was a Hanbali judge, Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Shirazi, who is the author of Al-Maqsad al-Arshad. Now this is an important point. In this time and before, in the early generations, particularly starting from the third, scholars among the four schools were very particular on writing biographical literature about who the different scholars were within their school. So if you look at, say, the biographical literature like Tabaqat al-Hanabila, Dhayl Tabaqat al-Hanabila, As-Suhab al-Wabila, Al-Maqsad al-Arshad, Mukhtasar Tabaqat al-Hanabila, and other books all put together, that shows you about 400,000 scholars from Ahmed ibn Hanbal up until now from the Hanbali school. That's not the layman, that's just the scholars, right? The Hanafis compiled similar literature. The Shafi'is compiled similar literature. The Malikis compiled similar literature, these biographical notices, so people would have historical literature on the different types of mujtahids, who these scholars were, what they did, and what they represented. Because it was important to know, from a legal standpoint, who these different ulama were. So this alim wrote Al-Maqsad al-Arshad, which is a latter day biographical notice on the Hanbali scholars. But other scholars were alive writing Hanafi textbooks on who they were. You have Abu al-Walid al-Gharnati, who was a Maliki judge, Tajuddin Abdul Wahhab ibn Ali al-Subki, who was a Shafi'i judge. Tajuddin al-Subki was considered one of the greatest ulama of his time. So great was his stature that when he became chief judge in Damascus, the actual people came out to meet him. And you may see this in your life, that you meet someone who's a sheikh or an alim. And it's not just that other sheikhs and ulama love them, but that the basic people love him as well. And you don't always find that in sheikhs and ulama, because sometimes the ulama status will be so high, some people won't be able to fully appreciate him because they don't understand what he's saying, his way of speaking, his terminology. They know that he's one of the ulama and they love him, but it's not the same connection. And sometimes you'll meet an alim or hear of an alim like Tajuddin al-Subki, where the people love him as well. And the people say, we want him to stay as our qadi in this district until he dies. Right? That is an example. Tajuddin al-Subki, rahimahullah, is such an example. Another alim that died, now Tajuddin al-Subki died 761AH. Shamsuddin Abu Abdullah al-Zarkashi, he died in 772. Some authorities say 774. Imam al-Zarkashi, I mentioned before, Abu al-Qasim al-Khiraqi, rahimahullah, he was the student of Imam Salih al-Baghdadi, who was the student of Imam Ahmad. Imam Abu al-Qasim al-Khiraqi wrote a book called Al-Mukhtasar, the Summation. 400 commentaries have been written on that book. Imam al-Zarkashi was one of those commentators. And Imam al-Zarkashi was an Egyptian. And Zarkashi was known for, because I've read that book, and he will take all of the positions that there are, because he's a mujtahid mutlaq fil madhab. He'll gather all the positions that there are, put them under one heading, and then he will slowly begin to unfold everything. I'm sorry, he's a mujtahid murajjih, excuse me. So as a preferential mujtahid, he'll gather everything together and then start to unfold it and say, okay, this belongs here, this belongs here, this belongs here. And he'll slowly begin to put the pieces together. And by the time you finish the chapter, let's say on wudu, not only do you have a greater understanding of wudu or what have you, but you understand why there are differences with all the aqwal and all the differences. You can see why. Another one is Sirajuddin Umar ibn Ishaq ibn Ahmed al-Ghaznawi al-Hindi, who's a Hanafi judge in Egypt. Now he actually came down from India, and he's originally from Azerbaijan. He's one of the big Hanafi ulama from Azerbaijan. He's actually from there. And he was such a great scholar that he actually had to be sent from where he was at to Egypt to be able to compete amongst all the Shafi'is, because he was greater than everyone else in his local township, in his area. And so the Hanafis of Egypt said, well, we have no one to compete with the Shafi'is. Can you send someone? He said, yes, we'll send Imam al-Ghaznawi. We'll send him down. And so they sent him, and he more than held his own. And so he gained respect, because the ulama, when people need fatwa, they're looking for someone to take fatwa from. And so he was there. Now this particular alim, as I said, he came from Azerbaijan al-Hindi. What you'll also find later, and you may want to note this just for later, is that when you look at a lot of the latter day hadith scholars, a lot of them will have the last name as Sindhi, because in the last 300 years and more ago, the big ulama of hadith, big ulama, were from Sindh. They were considered, in many accounts, as some of the people that preserve the science of hadith. Who can dispute the commentary Awn al-Ma'bud? Who can dispute Muhammad Hayat al-Sindhi, the great Sindhi alim? Who can dispute that alim? He came there, and the Hanafis said, we declare you the mufti of Makkah al-Mukarramah for the Hanafis. He hadn't even properly set his bags down or anything. His respect was that great. And these aren't, because a lot of people say, well, you know, the people, the ulama that aren't Arab, they don't know anything. No, these are Arabs. Dyed in the wool, Ismaili, from the household of the Prophet Ismail alayhi salam, dyed in the wool, brown Arabs. And they said, we declare you the mufti of this area. He wasn't even an Arab. It was about his ilm. Muhammad Hayat al-Sindhi in the biographical books is a major scholar. And even people that disagreed with him, he's one of the few scholars within the Hanafi school, perhaps as many as four perhaps, that I've ever heard of. There may be more, but I don't know of them. So that may be my defect. But he is one of perhaps as many as four Hanafi scholars. He wrote a book on it that was of the position that the hand should be placed under the chest, as is Imam Shafi'i's position. A handful. Major alim. One of the few. And he had to go through all types of written debates, and there were spoken debates, and there were all these things that were happening. It was in a spirit of a good atmosphere. It was very competitive, but subhanAllah. He wrote a book on the virtues of the beard. And he began the book by talking about, I've heard often people mention about hijab and the dangers of casting off the hijab and these other things. He says, but I found the men neglectful in the area. I find that there are men that are able to when they shave it. And these people are despicable. They are sinners. They are wretched. They're battaloon. They're that. And he went in this big 11-page attack on people that go around, in his words, quote, disfiguring their faces and nullifying their manhood. These are his words. Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi was one of those examples of those ulama. Al-Hindi, this alim al-Ghaznawi al-Hindi, is part of that great tradition of India. Abu al-Fath ibn Yusuf al-Sijzi, another Central Asian Hanafi scholar, a judge in Egypt. Badruddin al-Aqsarani, who was a Hanafi judge in Damascus. You have Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Jawashini, who was a Hanafi judge in Damascus. All of these figures I mentioned died in 773 AH. You have Imam Ahmed ibn Rajab al-Baghdadi, who was from Baghdad, but then came down to Damascus. He's the father of the famously known Imam ibn Rajab al-Hanbali. Imam Ahmed ibn Rajab died in 774 AH. You have Shamsuddin Muhammad al-Halabi, who was a Hanafi scholar and judge in Halab. Then you had Nasiruddin ibn al-Attar, who was a Hanafi historian and mathematician from Damascus. Okay, so this family, the al-Attar family, they're still there today in Damascus. They edit so many books on creed, on fiqh. They're still famously known today. Al-Attar means the itr seller, the people that used to make and sell itr. And some of them maybe still do, but that's what they were known for. So this name stuck, Al-Attar. So when you see their name on something, on the introduction to a book, a foreword to a book, a recommendation of a letter, a recommendation on a letter for someone, that person is thiqah. If somebody from the Al-Attar, some of the ulama, one of the ulama from the Al-Attar family says, such and such brother is thiqah, he's trustworthy, that's it. That's all there is to it. I don't care who he is. He's trustworthy. Because the Al-Attar family, they are princes in this ummah. They're princes. Some of them are Shafi'is, but the vast majority of them are Hanafis, and they are princes in this ummah. Certain families where you hear their names, you know you don't want a problem with. No one wants a problem with the Qadumis. No one wants a problem with the Shattis. No one wants a problem with the Attar family. No one wants the Ibn Badrans. No one wants any problem with those type of people, because they know what's going to happen. All of a sudden your crops fail or something horrible happens to you, because these are the people that are the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then you have Shamsuddin Muhammad al-Halabi, as I mentioned, Nasiruddin ibn al-Attar, and Abu al-Fida Ismail ibn Kathir, who all died in 774 AH. Abu al-Fida Ismail ibn Kathir is the famous Imam ibn Kathir that we know of history. He came from a family of Shafi'i judges and qadis. He was a student of Imam ibn Taymiyyah, Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. And when Imam Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah died in 728 AH, Imam ibn Kathir was 27 years old. He had already enrolled at the Jami'at al-Ashrafiyah, which is a prestigious school of creed and hadith, that one of the prerequisites is that you must be Ash'ari in your creed in order to study there. He studied there. He wrote a number of books. One of them is Jami' al-Masanid, where he took the Sihah Sitta, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Nasa'i. He combined them into one massive 30-volume work and wrote a huge commentary on them and discussed the science of hadith within them. I've seen that book once in my life at a sheikh's house and was told to stay away from it when I went to look at it. Because the people that are in charge of that, because naturally as a person that likes books, you're drawn to books. You're going to go and say, oh, can I look at this or can I see that? And I was told, no, leave that alone. That is something that is beyond you. So I left it alone. But what you see from him, the Jami' al-Masanid, absolutely amazing book. Absolutely amazing. What small sections I did see before I was told to put it away, amazing. His Tafsir al-Quran al-Azim, his Tafsir of the Quran, which has been translated into English and neutered and spayed. It deserves nothing more than the largest fireplace one can find in an Edwardian house and to go in, because that book has been absolutely neutered. The commentary on Surah Al-Ma'idah, the 5th Surah, Ayah 15, is lukewarm at best. And if the people that did that were to be lined up against the wall and shown the machine gun and let it fire, I would not feel bad for them, because they've intentionally lied. And you cannot find in that book where Imam Ibn Kathir begins and where Darus Salam and the apostate Saudi government ends. And this is the problem. This is the problem. That Tafsir al-Quran al-Azim is 4 volumes in Arabic. Let me just mention something brief about it. When Imam Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari rahimahullah wrote his Jami' al-Bayan wa Ta'wil, when he wrote that massive tafsir, Imam Ismail ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he wanted to summarize it and to make it accessible to the layman. And so he did. And the 4 volumes of that are what Tafsir al-Quran al-Azim is. It is a mukhtasar, it is a summation of the 23 or 25, depending on which printing houses. It is a summation of that massive commentary by Imam al-Tabari. That's what it is. And it's got fiqh rulings that Imam Ismail ibn Kathir rahimahullah has put in there. And you will find among the Arabs in their house, next to the 40 ahadith of Imam Nawawi, is the tafsir of Imam ibn Kathir. Because he's that well loved. If you want to make a point with the Arabs and you're talking something in tafsir, quote Imam ibn Kathir. If you want to make a point, quote him. If you want to make any point on tafsir, yeah, but Imam ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he said this. And then people say, well, we'll have to check that. And then when they check it, we did say that. He's probably right. Few people want to differ with him. Few people. Because his encyclopedic knowledge, you're talking about a man that in his mid-30s was the Qadi over 5 countries. Mufti and Qadi for 5 countries. 5. Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and what we're calling today is the State of Israel. Those 5 countries, he was the Shafi'i judge, hadith scholar, and Qadi at one point for those countries. That's the type of person Imam Ismail ibn Kathir rahimahullah was. We just think of him as, Tafsir ibn Kathir, but he's bigger than that. He's bigger than that. And when you look at his history, you look at all of what he's done, he wrote a book on history called Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, which was to cover from the beginning of time all the way up until his time. When he finished that, he then wrote The Signs of the End of the Time, which was connected to that book. Everything that you can expect that's going to happen after him. It is one of, with the exception of Ibn al-Imad and Ibn al-Jawzi, it is probably one of the best latter-day texts of history ever composed. Because it is thorough, it is in-depth, he gives you names, places, he tells you, sometimes like when I'm telling you Wednesday on this date, That's Ibn Kathir and Ibn al-Imad. They pay attention to detail. Wednesday. It happened on this date. Imam Ibn al-Imad, just to show you that, how serious it is, sometimes he'll tell you, and it was a very parched day. And it was cloudy. He'll actually give the weather and break down other things as well, just to show that he has this requisite knowledge. So when you talk about Imam Ibn Kathir, rahimahullah, you have to put him in that standpoint. A mujtahid, an alim, a faqih, and all of these things. You have to put him in his proper perspective. Then you have Muhyiddin al-Qurashi, Hanafi scholar who died in 775 AH. All right, Qurashi because he's from the household of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Quraysh. Qurashi, when you see on someone's name, when it's Qurshi or Qurashi, that is a reference to them being related to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I'm not sure how they do them here or in other places, but generally when people are related to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they're registered in some countries to keep those people from getting zakah and to keep them from claiming benefit, because it's haram for the household of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to take zakah or to take zakat al-fitr and to take benefit in things like that. They've been forbidden from that. There's a statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that mentions this, and it's further emphasized by the fact that there was zakat al-fitr lying around, and Al-Hasan went to take a piece of it, and he swatted his hand very hard, and he pulled his hand away, and he said, "We do not take from the zakat al-fitr. This has been made haram for us." So this is why it's so important that we know who these people are. Now we look at from the year 776 to 805. A famine struck in the year 777 AH, in which the people of Sham, so desperate for food, ate the dogs in the area and the bodies of the dead around them. A comet appeared in the sky after Isha prayer in the year 778 AH, and stayed there for a number of nights and grew bigger until finally disappearing after some time. Now, the difference about this comet is Allahu Alam whether it was Halley's Comet, which appears every 85 years, whether it was the Hale-Bopp Comet. It's really difficult to tell which one it was, because Imam Ibn al-Imad, rahimahullah, Ibn Kathir and others, they didn't actually give a lengthy explanation of the cyclical pattern of this particular comet, or whether it was a disturbance of one time. Some people might think that maybe it's Halley's Comet. It might be. But Allahu Alam, unless we really check deeply into history. So a famine strikes in 777 AH, and the people of Sham, because there was such a lack of food, they ate the dogs in the area and the bodies of the dead around them. Because it had to do, again, because there were some of these leaders that were more really figureheads. You had emirs, sultans, these different people. Often what would happen is they would use the treasury like their own personal wealth. And that would deprive money of other people. Their ulama would go, stop them, but then after a little while it would start again. And sometimes when there was any failure in the system with regards to wealth, what would happen is those leaders or sultans, they'd be safe. They would be fortified in their positions and in their fortresses. But the actual people would be starving. And it's a lesson that we learn about earthly rulership. When the year 785 AH came, some of the mu'adhdhins in Sham started reciting peace and blessings on the Prophet ﷺ after the adhan, and then it spread to some other places. The initial time had been by the command of Najmuddin at-Tanabdhi. Now, this is an important point. Sometimes you may go to a masjid, or you go to masjids, in which people before and after the adhan, وَالصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيْكَ يَا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ, they'll do that, right before or after the adhan. That's not an issue. That's not an issue. As long as they know that this is the basis of it, and not to persecute people or treat other people harshly who don't want to do it. Because this issue first came about in 785 AH. If somebody was to say, well, we do it because of the order of Najmuddin at-Tanabdhi, I don't have an issue with that. But if somebody comes in and they are there to give the adhan, and they tell them, do this, do the salat and salam before the adhan, and they refuse, and then they start to be harsh with them. They start to become harsh or reproachable. They start to become very stringent towards that person. That's bid'ah. Because that's not established. You have a custom and adah, and then you're trying to impose it upon someone that says, no, I don't want to do that. And you tell them, no, you have to do it. And then you always use that old red herring. Well, he doesn't respect the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He doesn't love Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He doesn't love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam because he doesn't want to do it. When the actual reality of it may be that he does love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or else why would he be in the masjid to come pray or give the adhan? He does love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but he doesn't want to do that. Right? So you have to, again, be more cosmopolitan in how things are looking. Do not go to a masjid or have someone come to a masjid that you frequent, and then because they don't do it exactly like you do it, then you say, well, subhanallah, these people, they don't know. Maybe you don't know instead. I don't know how many times this has happened where I've been places, or other people that I know have been places, and they've been treated harshly or persecuted or questioned. Their sunnitude has been sort of put on the bar. How Sunni is this guy? Let's send him an email. How Sunni are you? Try to get to the bottom of it. Let's ask him some questions. This should fortify us with what we need. But those people, they don't like to be put in the other situation because it puts them on the spot. When I went on Hajj in 2009, and people came with me that had this attitude, and now they're in the very cradle, the very basin of the Hanbali madhab, and they do dua, group dua after the Fard Salah, and they're accosted by the Imam and the congregation. I watched them from afar, not in pleasure, but saying to myself, do you now understand how it feels? Because they say for 1,200 years we've been upon this and we've never seen this. What is your creed? And they began to be interrogated. And they started to try to justify themselves. Oh no, it's from the Sunnah. They said, we're from the land of the Sunnah. It's not from here. Born and raised our whole lives. And the old men are saying, we've never seen it. The young people are saying, we've never seen it. The younger people are saying, we've never seen it. The Imam says, I studied for 12, 13 years. I've never seen it. It's not from this deen. And I thought, how does it feel to be on the opposite end and to receive that spoon of bitter medicine that you have to take? How does that feel? Well, eventually I had to get dragged in and involved. And I said, these people here are upon the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa. And I went into a long explanation. The Imam is very nice. Imam Khalid is a very nice man. And he said, yes, we respect him, but our way's still better. So you see, some people, you can't change it. And it's that same stringency, that attitude, Hanafi madhab or nothing, Ahmed ibn Hanbal or it's batil. It's that attitude that's going to keep people at each other's throats. You can have your preferred position without being a bigot or a nutcase. You can have your position, but do not persecute others. And those people that were there, I could see that after they'd been sort of beaten and broken down a little bit, they were more humble because they had taken the position with other people that somehow they didn't know the Sunnah. Now here you are, not far from Mecca, by people born and raised in Mecca and around that area that are telling you we're from the land of Islam. And where did you get that from? How do you defend against that? Where the gentle old man said the Quran came down in the Hijaz, not in Asia. How do you dispute with that old man? You can't. But even in the sense of what he's saying being correct, he's wrong in another sense because he was acting as if there was no other position in Islam but that. Is it bid'ah makruha? Yes. In the school of Ahmed and Malik, yes it is. Is it bid'ah muharrama? No. Because it's another position. And we could argue about that for hours. And generate a whole lot of heat and no light. So what I'm saying is you have to be willing to accept that there are these differences. You'll go to a masjid, they don't do salat and salam before. It's never been done at Masjid al-Haram. Before the Saudi excursion, it wasn't done there. The dome, Al-Aqsa, it's now done sometimes, intermittently at Al-Aqsa, but not all the time. The Umayyad, the Qarawiyyin, right? Not all the time. And some places not at all. That doesn't take away them being Sunni. Oh, I'm not sure. Those guys, they don't do Salat and Salam before. You might need to look at their Sunni identification. No, don't do that because it's not right. Further to this, we look at huge fires in 787AH. They burned large amounts of property in Egypt. While in 788AH, there was good news. Madrasatul Barquqiyya was being finally completed, and the scholars teaching at that place were there. Scholars from all 4 schools immediately began teaching there, and the people were flocking from different locations to learn or send their children. Barquq is usually one of the words used for plum. I don't know why. The ulama may have been because there was a ruler in that time who had the name Barquq, the madrasa of the plums. And Barquq, because it's luscious and it's filled with sweetness, maybe that was the wisdom and why they chose that name. But ulama from all 4 schools were teaching at this madrasa. That's togetherness. That's unity. That's working together. That's what this deen is about. That's what this ummah is about. That's what Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah is about. People working together, although they hold differences. Some of you in this room hold differences. They're peripheral differences, but they're differences that you hold on to very faithfully that are different to mine. And I hold differences that I cling to very faithfully, that I have, that are different to yours. But the fact that we're able to sit in the same room and pray behind one another and eat, enjoy each other's company, is a measure of the maturity that is within Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which we should continue to foster. Now, a large section of Damascus was burnt to the ground by a freak brush fire in 794 AH. Even minarets and part of the old quarter perished. This was also the time that the great Khan Tamerlane made his way to Iraq with a huge contingent of soldiers. Tamerlane destroyed Baghdad, Shiraz, and Tabriz in 795 AH, and there was much loss of life during his reign. He headed to Tikrit in 796 AH and besieged the area until surrender, and then he killed many people around that location. Tamerlane was the successor of the last great Khan. And so as Tamerlane began to do, and some people pronounce Tamerlank, as he began to go and to come back to these different cities as the great Khan, he devastated Baghdad, Shiraz, Tabriz, because they wanted these cities held under. One of the things that needs to be remembered about the Tatars is the Tatars were a mobile, conquering people. The demise that came to the Tatars came at their defeat at Ain Jalut from Baybars, and also came with them becoming a sedentary people. Because the Tatars, what they would do is they would conquer a people, take the whole population prisoner, and keep moving. And so as the army increased, people would think there must be millions of them. Yes, but most of them aren't soldiers. They're just prisoners that were taken and carried along, the goats and the sheep and the women and children. And you'd even sometimes see they'd be moving like a haze. And you'd find ulama that have been taken prisoner. They're praying their 5 times salah. There'd be Buddhists on the side with their incense burning, and Hindus and Christians doing the mass. And you say, what on earth is going on here? And for the Tatars, they felt the same way religiously. They're all the same to us. They're not Tatars. We'll take them all. And so when Tamerlane is going into these huge areas, he's just taking over and just absorbing and mobilizing. But what was happening is the Tatars were starting to settle down, which meant that some of them were starting to consider their position more in life, whether or not they want to stay nomadic. Some of them started to settle down and become Muslim in a real sense and get married. Some of them started to give up warfare. Some of them lost the ability to continue warfare because once they became sedentary, they didn't remember the art of war that they'd learned all those years ago in Central Asia. They forgot it. And their children became technocrats or bureaucratic and quite soft, chubby. And then they were easy to kill by the quicker, sharper, and more unrelenting Muslims who, although sedentary, would not give up. And so this is what was happening to them. Now 797AH began with Tamerlane and Tumuktush battling over the position of the great Khan. So there are people within the Tatars that are unhappy with what's happening. They want to still keep the very nomadic conquering pattern and either put to the sword all the people that are under them or take them prisoner back with them to Mongolia or the other Central Asian places and keep rolling along. Because the Mongols came, or the Tatars came, and as they rolled through, down from areas by Mongolia, across the Central Asian steppes, they pretty much engorged themselves on any empire that happened to be in the way. The Tatars were not a people that were looking for colonization. They were looking for conquest, subsistence of their agriculture, and food. Because in the course of battle and warfare, they'd run out of food and say, we're out of food, we're out of provisions. What do we do now? And they would say, well, we have to conquer somewhere new. They would conquer somewhere new, devastate, burn, loot, eat themselves out until they said, we have no food. We have to conquer somewhere new. And they carried on in this same vein. Well, eventually with the Muslims, as the Muslims start fighting back and they get defeated for the first time in history at Ain Jalut, they're out of provisions, they're out of food, and they've been defeated. Imagine what that did to their confidence. And then they began to have internal structural arguments among themselves and the tribulations that that creates. So this caused disarray in the army and led to minor skirmishes. The cracks in the Tatar strength became internally visible and not just externally after a number of setbacks and battles. Tamerlane conquered huge sections of India in the year 800 AH and began killing large numbers of people, starting with governors, scholars, and others. No difference was made between any religions. So we didn't care whether they're Brahmins, whether they are low caste, whether they're light, dark. Oh, these ones, they're Sri Lankans, leave them alone. No, he made no difference between them and slaughtered them all. And so the Tatars come in, and the word that was used for themselves sometimes besides Tatar, Mongol, gets corrupted to Mughal. And it's later that you would have what we're calling the Mughal Empire. And so you find people that are sometimes classified, oh, this person, he's from Muhajir Baradari, he's from the Mughals, and all these other things. Yes, he's from those lineage, but probably so are you. Because you go back far enough, and maybe your name is Temurlenk or Uktush or Ipchak, or you have these strange names, and you think, oh, we must be from Russia. No, you're not from Russia. You're from somewhere else. And you try to carry on because this synthetic nation called Pakistan has been created, that you're all one race, even though none of you look like each other. You've created this whole structure that, oh, we're Pakistanis. Well, what was there before 1947? Well, there was nothing. Okay, so then what were you then? Well, then there was undivided India. Okay, so what was there before then? And then you have the Mughal Empire. Then the white Mughals, when the Pathans came down from Afghanistan and conquered, there was this era of very fair kings who were harsh and brutal and all these other things. All this is connected with historical facts that are happening now. If you ever wonder why there are some in which there's a strong resemblance between someone in your family, and then you look at someone that's, say, from Laos, or someone from Burma, or someone from somewhere in Central Asia, Samarkand, and you think, subhanAllah, this is an uncanny appearance. Or people who speak Urdu and they've spoken to Kurdish people and they find, whoa, I actually understand half of what they're talking about. Or people who spoke Osmanje, which is the old Turkish, and then they speak to someone who speaks Urdu, and the person that knows Urdu understands everything, and the person in Urdu answers back, but the person who knows Osmanje can't reply to them because they don't know enough of what they're saying. That's not accidental. There's reasons for that, because it's a lot of the intermixing and things that happen here. Now, 801AH entered upon people with a plethora of amirs, governors, sultans, khalifas, and other people claiming leadership. In spite of this issue, the scholars still kept sending out armies and so forth. Another great fire swept through Mecca in the year 802 AH and damaged property and also sections of Al-Masjid al-Haram. Al-Musta'in Billah became the new Khalifa, after the death of his father Al-Mutawakkil ala Allah the first, in the year 808 AH. Al-Musta'in would be the 44th Abbasid Khalifa. Al-Mu'tadid, the second, would come to power in the year 816 AH, making him the 45th Abbasid Khalifa, followed by Al-Mustakfi the second in 843 AH, the 46th Abbasid Khalifa. Although figureheads, people could see that the Abbasids would soon disappear as the royal family was starting to lose contact with fresh blood for marriage and the symbolic support of the people. Only 10 years later, in 853 AH, Al-Qa'im would become the 47th Abbasid Khalifa after the death of the previous one. Now, here's why this is important. The Abbasids were dying. Just their symbolic power was dying. They hadn't had any real power since, well, Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la took it from them. So they were dying. They were eroding. They were eating themselves from the inside out. Arab men marrying Turkish or Armenian wives. But because their power base was slipping, because they had no influence to implement anything, they started to glide further and further away. Baghdad gets sacked, they're taken to Egypt. What do they have to do there? The Egyptians recognized them in terms of their lineage, but they didn't know them as a people. The Egyptians knew Baybars, Qutuz, his sister Julanhar. All these other people, they didn't know who any of those people were on any real personal level. And so the Abbasids in many ways were alienated from the Egyptians and the North Africans. Also during this time, the Seljuks were starting to wear down. And now you had Uthman I and his children, the Ottomans. They're starting to gain influence and rolling over the desert. And what they'd done is they'd converted to Islam. They'd come into the religion, and they, to put it in no other word but a simple word, they went madhab shopping. And what they said is, we're going to take on something that is going to become our governing system for our transactions, buying, selling, renting. We're going to use that. We as a Turkish people have a very complex family structure. We need a complex system. And so they looked at each of the four and they said, the Hanafi one seems the most complex, that can deal with the complexities of our society. We're taking that. And they became missionaries for the Hanafi madhab. Everywhere they went, they set down minarets, masjids, which is how the Hanafi madhab was able to spread, as we mentioned before, in regards to administration and being inside the administrative structure of the government. The Abbasids took it that way and further. Everywhere where the Ottomans were, Hanafi madhab was there. It was there. And they brought it back. I mean, they made people forget that for 500 years, Hanafi was associated with Mu'tazila. They made people forget that, because they pushed that madhab so hard and they put such fear into the kuffar and into the cults that the Hanafis were now held in their own right as being every bit as acceptable as the other three. Because there was always that perception, as the Hanafis had been working on it and building up their scholars from Central Asia, there'd always been that perception that because Hanafis had Mu'tazila among them, they're really not quite on par. They're Sunnis and everything, but they're not as on par as the rest of us. And so what happened is the Ottomans brought that up. And as the Ottomans rolled along, they continued the process of consolidating and defeating the Tatars, leading to cases of Tatar mass conversion. So then what do the Tatars become? Muslims? What madhab? Hanafis. So the Mughals become what? Muslims. What madhab? Hanafis. And the Mughal Empire are Muslims? Yes. What madhab? Hanafis. The white Mughals, they become Muslim. What madhab? Hanafis. That's how all this happened. And you have the Ottomans and the Seljuks in a wider sense, but the Ottomans more specifically to thank for that. Spreading the fiqh, spreading the knowledge, building on the knowledge that's there. All these massive monuments, these big tiled buildings. all these stone monuments. Who on earth is there that can dispute the resplendent glory of these huge, mammoth masjids in Turkey or the areas around them? The Suleymaniye with the 7 concentric domes. Those are built by our Sunni fathers, particularly Hanafis, built those. They redeemed the madhab. No one now, with the exception of cases that happen or outrages that happen, but generally when people think Hanafis, they think Sunnis. No one generally, unless something's mentally wrong with them, is going to think that there's something wrong with Hanafis. Because they've redeemed it. People have forgotten, with the exception of the books of history that have been quoted, generally people don't think of it that way. Right? And so that's what I'm saying. Now the challenge is now, as I mentioned before, the challenge for Hanafi scholars now is, in light of the fact that they have no big government to roll out, they have to either make one or they have to think of alternative means of administrating to their people. Because right now, out of all the 4 schools that administrate, they're struggling the most. And so they have to think of ways to do it. And that's why when you look at the Central Asian Hanafis, they've become more conservative than the Hanafis that are Arabs. If you look at the Hanafi fiqh as a study in the Arab world and the fatwas that some of the Hanafi ulama give that are Arabs, they are perceived by the Central Asians as they're lenient. Those guys are liberal. Example, the language of the khutbah. Some of the Hanafi ulama that are Arabs, they say, well, if it's in Arabic or the national vernacular, it's not an issue. Oh, yes, it is, say the Central Asian Hanafi ulama. What you need to do to fix this situation is you have the bayan, which will be the lecture that you'll have before in whatever vernacular, and the khutbah will be in Arabic. What's wrong with you people? That's how it's held. Very conservative. Why? Because in the collapse of the governing and everything that those Hanafi ulama saw, the scholars of Central Asia, particularly what we're calling Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, wanted to make sure to hold on to things. So they've stayed very conservative in order to protect what was left of what they had from a fiqh standpoint, because they were no longer governing. And without administration, they could not roll out a lot of what they wanted to do. And so the challenge for Hanafi scholars today is to sort of think out of the box and try to revive some of that vitality, either by getting big government. Well, how will they do that? Well, by taking one, by taking over and getting big government. India doesn't need to be separate from Pakistan and Bangladesh. It was all one anyway. What's the deal? What's the big difference? They're all Hanafis anyway. And the ones along the coast that are Shafis, they'll blend in. It doesn't make a difference. So right now, because they're a madhab, the Hanafi fiqh, because they're social conservatives, they're fiscal and social conservatives in their fiqh, they need big government in order to implement that. Under Hanafi fiqh, when you look at the Ottomans and the Abbasids, government was huge, military spending big, and the private sector was small. But it worked if you've got big government. That's why in Pakistan and India, these places, they're thinking, how come the ulama are so this, the ulama are so that? Because they need a bigger government. The government's too small. They can't administrate there. That's why. They need bigger government. Now, deaths during this time include Sharafuddin ibn al-Kafri, who was a big Hanafi scholar, Ibn Abdul Haq al-Hanafi, the Damascus judge. Both of them died in 776 AH. You have Dhunnun ibn Ahmed as-Surma, again, another Hanafi judge from Azerbaijan. They produced some great ulama, Azerbaijan and Armenia. They produced a lot of great Hanafi ulama. Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, an Egyptian Shafi'i scholar. Now, I want to mention something about him. He is one of the great scholars of the past, along with Badruddin Abu Abdullah ibn Asbasalar al-Ba'li in 777. Now, I want to say something about each of these, but I'll come to Asbasalar first. Imam Abu Abdullah Muhammad Badruddin Asbasalar is known. He was a preferential mujtahid, a mujtahid murajjih. He wrote few books. his main book that he wrote was this one here, At-Tasheel fi Fiqh. It's a standard primer for any students that go through it. So from adolescents all the way up to, say, 17, 18-year-olds, I've done the first half of it with some students, and they found benefit in it, this particular text. People have found benefit in it. It's easy to read. It makes sense. The Arabic reads very simply. All right? It's probably maybe comparable in terms of its briefness. It might be comparable with, say, Imam Panipati's Ma la budda minhu, or something along those lines. It's very, very basic like that. Asbasalar, a big island, but was Turkish, coming from what's now Turkey, Asian extraction. You have Taqiyuddin al-Qalqashandi, an Egyptian Shafi'i scholar who died in 768AH, who was a great Shafi'i scholar, specialized in hadith. Abu Ja'far al-Gharnati, who was a Maliki scholar of Andalus. Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad al-Tarsusi, Hanafi scholar, in 779AH. Tarsus is Tarsus, which is in today's Turkey. So before the Ottomans had even really set down a state properly, they'd already sent out some of their missionaries to build on what they'd started and to have ulama in those places. And Tarsus, or Tarsus, was one of those places. Ruknuddin Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Qarmi, who was also a Hanafi judge, and Ibn al-Kishk, who was a Hanafi judge from Damascus in 783AH. Nowadays in Egypt, the Kishk family, some of them are Shafi'is and some of them are Hanafis. Like Abdul Hamid Kishk, right? Shafi'i, right? Great preacher, great scholar. But most of the Kishk family are Hanafis. Most of the Kishk family are Hanafis. Very great history. Very great history. Ruknuddin died along with Ibn al-Kishk in 783AH. You have Akmaluddin al-Babarti al-Rumi, who's a Hanafi judge from the city near Istanbul today. You have Sharafuddin al-Ibtali, who's a Hanafi judge in Damascus in 786AH. Ibn Adim al-Hanafi in 787AH. Shamsuddin al-Qunawi, who was a Hanafi scholar of great repute who died in 788AH. Al-Qunawi are the scholars that are coming again from Central Asia. You cannot get away from the Central Asian Hanafi scholars. They're remarkable. You cannot get away from them. You're going to have to deal with them as a fact of life. One of the best books you could ever read on usul fiqh, one of the best you could ever read, is a book by Abu Bakr al-Harawi. Abu Bakr al-Harawi. He's a big Hanafi scholar from Herat in Afghanistan. Abu Bakr al-Harawi wrote a book called Ghayatul Su'al, which means the furthest answer to the short question. Abu Bakr al-Harawi, wonderful alim, wrote consistently on different topics. But particularly his strong point was usul fiqh. And you'll find if you look in any usul fiqh books, particularly when you start talking about fiqh that's to do with sadd al-dhara'i, which means preventative measures. Like, for example, you sometimes stop some things to prevent bigger things from happening that could be haram. Hanafis are mentioned in a major way in those. Because Hanafis have a big investment in sadd al-dhara'i, preventative measures. Because as administrators and being socially conservative and fiscally conservative from a financial standpoint, that's why Hanafis had massive armies, because they would speak to them and they'd have these huge governments. They used to speak to these Hanafi governors, these Hanafi rulers, and said, why is your army so huge? Your government is so huge, it's absolutely enormous. Why? So we never have to fight. And if we do, we annihilate our opposition quickly and we bring our troops home fast. It works. If you show up with 500,000 men on the border of someone's country that's messed with you, alhamdulillah, if you don't have to fight. Because the message that you have 500,000 people ready to go at any one time travels quickly. If you do go to war and you stamp them out like fleas, well then word spreads to others, do not bother those people. They've got 500,000 and they will eliminate you. That's why the preventative measures, sadd al-dhara'i, and that's why some of the Hanafi fuqaha allowed and pushed hard for Abdul Qadir Khan to get the nuclear bomb for Pakistan. Preventative. Why? Because it's better if we think that the Indians may do something that we drop it first on them. Because we need to have preventative measures. They're less likely to invade if they know that we have not a nuclear bomb, but nuclear bombs. It's easier and more preventative. And so those Hanafi ulama said they should get it and pushed for them to get it. Whereas, say, some of the Shafi'i scholars wouldn't. So in countries that are predominantly Shafi'i, they've generally tried to get them not to have it. Because mutually assured destruction has been a principle that a lot of the Shafi'i ulama, they don't like that because, okay, they drop it on us, then we drop it on them. But what does that mean? That's the end of everything. Or possibly the end of everything. The Hanafi scholars say, no, it won't, because the day of resurrection must come. Humanity must go on until the day of resurrection. So if we drop it on them, we know the day of judgment is not going to come straight away, because humanity must live until that time. And so we're going from the qadr of Allah to the qadr of Allah, and we're dropping it on them because it's the qadr of Allah. And that's their position. And I respect that. You have to respect the Hanafi scholars because they're thinking pragmatically. India's next door. Bangladesh seceded. India's next door. Kashmir's been absorbed into all types of madness. So what the Hanafi scholars are saying is get the bomb. Because what's next? They absorb Sindh? Northwest frontier? What are they going to absorb? What other province are they going to absorb? That's what they're thinking. So it's always sadd al-dhara'i. They're thinking of preventative measures. Now, other ulama who also died during this time, but we'll mention one person. His name is Mikhail al-Aslami. He was executed as he became a Muslim after having been a Christian, and then sought to bring other Muslims to Christianity through covert means. The charges were brought, and 49 witnesses from all walks of life were brought forward in 789 AH when he was executed. Okay, so there are people back then and now who become or say that they've become Muslim or Christians and will go to try to subvert Muslims and to convert them to Christianity. And so this person, when it was found out what he was doing, he was held on trial like everyone else deserves. They had 49 witnesses, went through all the structure, went through everything else. And then when it was found that this was the case, he was executed. Just the same way that Jahm ibn Safwan and Ja'ad ibn Dirham, they were executed for spreading the belief that the Quran was created, because it was to stop tribulation from coming to the population in which the whole society could be brought down. So sometimes people get punished by a death sentence because the whole society could be brought down. Rape, which is the death penalty according to many fuqaha, is because it's an attack on society in general. You attack and you attack, the woman's never going to forget that. Armed robbery is the death penalty. Crack and dope smuggling is the death. If they catch you doing that in the Gulf, they know that you've got drugs, you're going to die. Now, that's because of what it represents, an attack on society. And those ulama think and they say that this must be stopped. It's got to be stopped. And this was an example, this Mikhail al-Aslami. There are other examples of people who have done the same thing today in our midst, that say we've become Muslim. Sometimes people that have sincerely become Muslim and they've come into the deen and with lack of knowledge have caused incalculable damage. Incalculable damage. And so that's why you have to think and always pay attention to what's going on around you. Other people who died during this time. Sharafuddin al-Kurdi, who was a Hanafi scholar. Very few Kurds are Hanafi. Very few. Most Kurds are Shafi'is because of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi and Nuruddin Zinki and others. So he's a rarity. A Kurdi Hanafi scholar is a rarity. Minhajuddin al-Rumi, Hanafi scholar. They both died in 791 AH. You have Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi al-Ghurnati, who's a great Maliki scholar of Andalus. He died 795 AH. He died 795 AH. Now, Imam al-Shatibi. Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi rahimahullah was from Gharnata, which is today called Granada. He was from a family of high-ranking Maliki ulama. He is considered perhaps one of the greatest usuliyun, scholars who wrote on usul al-fiqh that ever lived. His most famous works are al-muwafaqat, the points of agreement, where he contrasts between the different positions in fiqh, in usul al-fiqh, and another book called al-i'tisam. Al-i'tisam billah, that book, take the firm handhold to what Allah has given and to Allah. That book explains what is innovation, why does it happen, how does it happen, the difference between a valid innovation in science and math and other things, and impermissible innovations, how people fall into innovations when people accidentally commit innovation and don't realize it, and then it becomes a custom among them. He goes into all the depth on these matters. And then he sums everything up with a discussion on who is the safe sect. Who is Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah? Who is the safe sect? He discusses who the cults are. I've looked at al-muwafaqat and al-i'tisam. And just as a reader, I would probably say that al-i'tisam is his greatest work. Because the issue of innovation, he's so precise and so sharp and so to the point. Every single statement that he makes is just a few sentences long. And you can just sit and reflect on that. It's so profound. Imam al-Shatibi. And if you mention his name around people that know anything about usul, you say, yes, what do you say about Imam al-Shatibi? Straight away, oh yes, he's a great, wonderful alim. He's a wonderful scholar. He's done this, he's done that. I studied al-Muwafaqat when I was doing my final year at Iftah class or whatever. They've heard of him. Because Imam al-Shatibi, he was one of the first ulama to start to witness the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain by the Catholic Church. He started to witness it. He witnessed the bodies dug up of deceased Muslims and stabbed with javelins. He witnessed people being killed. They would take them out and say, show us your penises. They would say this to the Muslims, the males. And if they found they were circumcised, they killed them. They killed them straight away. They would tell them, if we see you making a ghusl or heading to a bathhouse on Friday, they would close the bathhouses in certain cities. If we see you going there, we're going to kill you. And so sometimes they would just go in and they would kill all the Muslim men in the bathhouse who were going into these stalls to have a shower for ghusl, for Jum'ah. They'd kill them. Every single aspect of Islam, he watched some cities start to fall to the Reconquista and the tribulation that came from that, from Ferdinand and Isabella, that would later speed up that process. But he witnessed a lot of the early signs of it. 1492 AD, which is coming soon, inshallah, on our notes, that was sort of a seminal time. From 1492 to 1699 is where it was full demolition of the Muslim places. In 1699, between 1.2 and 1.6 million Muslims were expelled from Spain and Portugal. And they were told to carry their dead with them. That's why there's no Umayyad. Why is it that we ruled there for 950 years and all the Umayyad rulers are buried in Morocco and Algeria and Mauritania? What on earth are they doing there? Well, because we had to take them with us. Qurtubi, he's not from Morocco, but he's buried there. Imam al-Qadi Iyad, he's not from there, but he's buried in Morocco. Why is he buried in Morocco? He's from Andalus, because they made us dig up the bodies of our people and move them. So you should understand what's coming. And Imam al-Shatibi already was seeing glimpses of what was coming. Another scholar, Zainab bint al-Harraniya, she's the niece of Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahumullah. She died in 799 AH. She was a memorizer of hadith. Some records put her knowledge at 200,000, some 300,000. Allahu alam which one it was. But she had extensive knowledge of hadith. Extensive. Far more than 100,000. Extensive knowledge of hadith, usul fiqh, and she took after her uncle in terms of studying the different sciences of sources of differences of opinion. You have Jamaluddin Az-Zarnadi, the great Hanafi scholar in 800 AH. You have Alauddin al-Ba'ali, who died in 803 AH. Now, Alauddin al-Ba'ali, he wrote a number of books. Probably his most famous one is Al-Ikhtiyarat al-Fiqhiyya min Fatawa Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. In this, what he did is he took Imam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, all of his books, and he fleshed out the most beneficial points and put them in this small volume. He was a student of another alim, who I'll talk about in just a moment. And he wound up being the qadi and judge over 5 countries. Similar to Ibn Kathir. Over 5 countries, he was the qadi and the judge, fatwa writer for them as well. So he would receive bags of mail, sit down over the weekend, answer them, and try to have them sent back. Imam Alauddin al-Ba'ali, what stands out about him is he walked a middle path with regards to Imam Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. There are some people who took a path in which they declared him outrightly they declared him a kafir or an innovator. They would just say Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah is a kafir, he's an innovator. He did not walk that line. There were some people who took the line that was the greatest scholar that ever lived, or one of the greatest scholars that ever lived. He walked the middle line between that he was a magnificent scholar, but that he wasn't a kafir, and that he'll distill from his writings the best of it. And that's what al-Ikhtiyarat al-Fiqhiyya is to rescue Ibn Taymiyyah from his admirers and his detractors, and to put him in his proper historical context as a faqih, as a mujtahid murajjih, and to present him as how he is. And you can see sometimes some of the fiqhi things that Imam Ibn Taymiyyah will mention, and Imam al-Ba'ali will come right behind him and say, now you must remember, this is a minority situation that he has mentioned, and it's a rare issue. So rare that he is the only one that's ever stated it. So he'll make statements like that, but in a respectful tone. In a very, very respectful tone. So in tackling the issue of 3 talaq said in one sitting, Imam al-Ba'ali was very careful, because wrong or not, is still an alim, still a mujtahid. So you have to be careful how you address and how you treat a mujtahid, because this is a person in the hadith in the Sahih of Muslim who the Prophet ﷺ says when he's right he gets 1 reward, he gets 2 rewards, and when he's wrong he gets 1. This is these type of people. So you have to be careful about what you say about them. So Imam al-Ba'ali, remarkable scholar, he dealt with that topic very well. Now his teacher is Imam Abdul Rahman Jamaluddin ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah. Imam ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, I think there's probably 2 of his books translated into English. One of them that has to do with the heirs or the inheritors of the prophets, that's in English. The translation is decent. The Jami' al-Ulum wal-Hikam is almost neutered, because his discussion on the narrators of the hadith has been deleted, and his commentary hasn't fully been left in place. So you're only getting sort of the juice, but not all the meat from the soup. Ibn Rajab, he is number 3 voice in the school of Imam Ahmed rahimahullah, after Imams Muwafiquddin and after Imam Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah. He is on record of having the level of 700,000 ahadith memorized. 700,000. And he wasn't mujtahid murajjih either. But he's memorized more than Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. By his memorization of hadith, he's on par with the students of Imam Ahmed. 700,000, that's how much Abu Bakr al-Athram memorized. That's more than Bukhari memorized. That's more than Abu Dawood memorized. That's more than what Muslim memorized. Imam Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah. His book on Usul al-Fiqh, normally Usul al-Fiqh books are volume, 2 volumes. His is 6. And he says, I'm only doing this book as a small primer, a beginner, to cover 50 masail in Usul al-Fiqh. 50 masail over 5 volumes. That's not a primer. That's subhanallah. That's a last will and testament. That's a massive book. But he left that behind. He did a commentary on the Sahih of Imam Muslim. He did a commentary on the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari. He didn't finish it, but he got up to the book of Hajj, if memory serves me correct. Ibn Rajab rahimahullah, with his knowledge and his depth, he was one of the great scholars of his time. And he was above the mujtahidun and murajjihun in his knowledge, but was still subordinate to them. And that's why he's such an unusual figure, because his hifz is so enormous. The breadth of his knowledge is such to where when he would refer to masail, he would narrate not just all the ahadith on the subject, but every single variation that there is in the hadith. Every single variation. So when you talk about people like this, Ibn Rajab, you have to put him in his proper perspective, from a hadith standpoint, from a fiqh standpoint, from a creed standpoint. He dealt with all these matters. He wrote a book, Lata'if al-Ma'arif, on the different holidays that Muslims have throughout their calendar. The 2 Eids, right? What they're supposed to do in each month, if there's any sunnah things. And if there's things that aren't sunnah, he talks about why. Why isn't this the case? He goes into all these details. He discusses them, right? He mentions about the Eids and the virtues of the Eids, Laylatul Qadr, the different aspects of Ramadan, the virtues of Ramadan, the secrets of the fasting of Ramadan. He discusses all these things, right? He's about 3 men down from our grand Sheikh, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani rahimahullah. He's 3 men down from him. He's one of the Senate carriers. He's one of the khulafa in the tariqah. Very remarkable scholar, and you can see from his character that he stands out. You have another scholar, Abdul Jabbar al-Khawarizmi, he was a Mu'tazila Hanafi who assisted the Tatars by telling people not to resist him. He died in 804 AH. He was the last of his kind for the most part. He was the last of his kind. Then you find Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the Shafi'i judge. He died in 852 AH. Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani wrote a number of books in the science of hadith, and he wrote this, the Fath al-Bari. Al-Fath al-Bari is his commentary on the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari. This is actually the completion of Imam Ibn Rajab's work, which has the same title. Imam Ibn Hajar rahimahullah showers a lot of respect on Imam Ibn Rajab in the opening pages of this Fath al-Bari, and finishes off, he starts the same way, but he finishes off what Imam Ibn Rajab couldn't finish because he died. So with Fath al-Bari by Imam Ibn Hajar, you're getting 2 ulama within one book, which I think is a virtue. And he goes through all the different narrations and chains and any differences of opinion. He goes into everything. I mean, sometimes he'll be discussing a narrator and say, this narrator, in the early part of his life, he was acceptable. But when he narrates hadith in the latter part of his life, he's not acceptable because he suffered a head injury and that affected his memory, and you can't take from him in this issue. So when he's narrating this hadith from this sheikh, that's in his later life. He had a head injury. Don't take from him. But in this, before his head injury, alhamdulillah, he's fine and he's authentic. When you have narrators that will sometimes have the same name, he can tell you, now this one, sometimes people mix them up because they both have the same name. But this person is this person, and this person is this person. And he can tell you who they are. His books on usul al-fiqh on the science of hadith are standard reference manuals. One of the great Shafi'is from Al-Azhar University. He was the chair at Al-Azhar. Remarkable scholar. Imam Ibn Hajar, he wanted to quit in the early part of his career because the science of hadith was so grueling and so difficult. And one of his teachers, a female scholar, said, "Young man, do not quit. I perceive greatness in you. You must not give up. You must continue." And he continued, and he worked hard at it. until he became one of the greatest hadith scholars of all time. If you find someone speaking ill of Ibn Hajar or saying he's a great scholar, but don't sit with that person. Because certain people, this ummah just agrees upon. Imam al-Nawawi, Imam Ibn Hajar is one of them. Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, rahimahullah, he's one of them. People just agree on him. If someone quotes to you and says, if two people get in a discussion about a hadith in Bukhari, what does this hadith mean? No, it doesn't. You're lying. It means this. No, you're a liar. No, you're both liars. And there's this massive discussion. And someone who has access to the Arabic language goes over, takes Ibn Hajar down from his shelf, from the Fath al-Bari, from the relevant volume, reads the necessary page of the hadith, the commentary, the transmission on the hadith, the Arabic grammar that surrounds the hadith. That should be the end of the discussion for you. Well, that's it. Shaykh has said it. That's it. Now, another alim, one of the greatest ulama of all time in hadith, was alive during his time. You may care to take a note of him. His name is Badruddin Mahmud al-Aini, the great Hanafi scholar. The great Hanafi scholar. And chief qadi over the houses for Hanafis in Egypt. If he is not the greatest Hanafi scholar that ever lived from Egypt, he is one of the greatest. Imam Badruddin Mahmud al-Aini. He found out about Imam Ibn Hajar's classes on Fath al-Bari, and he had some of his students go to them, and they would write down the notes and take it back, and he would answer them. When Imam Ibn Hajar found out about this, he wrote a letter to the other authorities to copyright his book, that he couldn't breach his book. So Imam Badruddin al-Aini, he waited. And when the book came out, he was the first one to buy the Fath al-Bari, and he wrote a commentary going against the Fath al-Bari called Umdat al-Qari, which is the answer to Fath al-Bari from the Hanafi position. Because Ibn Hajar would sometimes say, and the position regarding the hands is that they go under the chest, and there is no evidence otherwise. That's fiqh. Imam Badruddin al-Aini rahimahullah would come and say, now some have said, and they have used great hastiness in their speech, that there's no proof of placing the hands anywhere other than below the chest. We will show you and take the film. We will show you and take the film and the veils from your eyes to prove to you otherwise. And he would go into all the proofs and the evidences. And it's a wonderful, it shows you how you can have a friendly rivalry between yourselves. Because the Shafi'is and the Hanafis have always been very competitive with each other, because of issues of usul al-fiqh and things. They've always been very competitive. So that book is one of the ones where you can get a greater understanding of the Fath al-Bari, Umdat al-Qari. You get a greater understanding of Fath al-Bari and the fiqh issues that are difference of opinion. You can compare those and get a greater understanding. And then finally we have Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, rahimahullah, the great Shafi'i judge. Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, rahimahullah, dies in 852 AH. Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, originally coming from Asyut in South Egypt. He dies in 864 AH. One of his books, Al-Hawi lil-Fatawa. Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti wrote 625 books in every single science of the Sharia. I'll say that again. He wrote 625 books in every single science of the Sharia. He said one day, because he was glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he said to some of the other ulama, because he said, I don't say I'm the most knowledgeable of all time, but I say that I am the most knowledgeable in my time, with the exception of Al-Khidr. If you should gather all the ulama in front of me, if I was to blow on them with my breath, I would blow them down. That's how confident he was about his knowledge and his ilm. If you brought them all in front of me and I just blew on them, they would just fall over. That's how much ilm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me. Now this alim, he is really, in a sense, the first one who popularized the position in a really strong way. The position had been stated before by some Ash'aris, but he was the first one to really give it mobility, particularly in Egypt, where he was at, where he lived. He gave the position mobility among Ash'aris that the Prophet ﷺ's grandfather, his uncle Abu Talib, and then his parents all died Muslims. Because that was not the prior Ash'ari position. The prior position was the opposite of that. And I won't quote it again other than to say that it was the opposite of what most people in this room think. Now, he did that. It popularized among the Ash'aris. How? Because he took a lot of the proofs that the Maturidis, the latter-day Maturidis, used, and he incorporated it into his books, particularly Al-Hawil al-Fatawa. And he bolstered the proofs and discussed it from a hadith standpoint because he was a wonderful hadith scholar. And he championed this position. And so now, today, from all the disputes that are happening regarding this issue, you find Imam Suyuti's name usually near the top of the list of, no, listen, the ulama have said, a lot of them have said that this is the position. Look, what is this? Imam Suyuti has said in Al-Hawil al-Fatawa that this is our position. Because he popularized it that strongly. Prior to that time, that was not the dominant position that the Ash'aris held. They held the opposite position. Imam Suyuti at one point was seen, when he got in a discussion with some of the ulama, the language that he used made them ask him, are you claiming that you're an absolute mujtahid? And he said, no, because he said that I look directly at the sources and I derive with istikhraj and istinbat. And the language that he was using, some of the ulama said, are you claiming that you're an absolute mujtahid? He said, no, I am still very much attached to the school, but I'm saying that Allah has blessed me with all the teachers that I've had, that I'm able to look at things and have itqan that other scholars don't have. Because obviously absolute ijtihad, you see, requires an absolute mujtahid to teach you, which would have been the next question that those ulama would have asked. So fortunately, he answered correctly and said, no, I'm not claiming that. Now, Imam al-Suyuti, also in the latter part of his life, he isolated himself from the people and wrote extensively. This is part of where his 625 books came from. He wrote a tafsir called the Jalalain. Him and another author, Imam Jalaluddin al-Mahalli, wrote this book. It's commentary. It's supposed to be a short, pithy tafsir of the Quran that someone can use for linguistic and other purposes. Right? The commentary, a book on, I think the best commentary on the Jalalain is the Hashia by Imam Ahmed al-Sawi, the great Maliki scholar, who died 1282 Hijri, if memory serves me correct. That's probably, I think, Allahu Alam, the best commentary on the Jalalain, because it's 4 volumes. It's really good. It's really good. So in looking at then these ulama, like Imam Suyuti, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, we realize that the era of the murajjihun, the mujtahid murajjih, is grinding to an end. And so the books become smaller. Books become smaller, so they're not massive like they were before. The commentaries start to become shorter, right? There starts to be less of some of the open debate that we saw and more consolidation of what's already there. This is the aftermath of the extinction of the mujtahidun al-murajjihun. But their legacy remains behind. It remains with us. أقول قولي هذا استغفر الله لي ولكم أستغفر الله إن الله غفور رحيم يرحم الراحمين. Now, alhamdulillah, Allah blessed us to end on time. Is there a question over any of what we've covered today from the believers? Is there a question? Because I know I must have left something out, or maybe I didn't explain something in depth as fully as it could have been covered. Is there a question from anyone? Something that I've left out? No? There's no question at all? SubhanAllah. That just shows I didn't think that it was that clear, but alhamdulillah, if it was, mashallah. Next week, we should, inshallah, be covering from 865 to 965. So, inshallah, we come close to the Ottoman takeover. And hopefully, inshallah, we reach it. And please remember to make dua for us, inshallah, as we make dua for you. Wassalamu alaikum.